This week we'll be talking about the history of artificial intelligence. Of course, the electronic computers weren't invented until the 1940s or so you might think that this is a pretty recent history. But in this video, I'm going to go over what I think of as the prehistory of AI, which I think goes quite a bit further back, especially in terms of the kind of conceptual framework in which thinking about reasoning as something that a machine might do comes to be. I'm not going to answer the mystery of why a robot would need a heads-up display that comes out of its own head. We'll just have to leave that as a mystery. Okay, but recall this talk we had about the mechanical worldview that comes out of the scientific revolution. The idea is just that the whole world can be understood as a big, complex mechanism. And remember what this is a rejection of, right? So before the development of the mechanical worldview in Europe, Aristotle was the main kind of conceptual structure in which physics and science generally took place. And in Aristotle, things move with goals and purpose. For Aristotle, the world is rich with meaning, right? Rocks have goals, fire has goals, things have essences which define what they are, and you can sort of see those things directly. Like your mind is in kind of fairly direct contact with the essential structure of the world, which is brimming with meaning and purposes. So in the scientific revolution, we see a rejection of that idea. We see a rejection of the idea that the world contains the meaning and purpose of things, or that the world contains essences. All the world contains, according to this view, is a bunch of stuff that sort of physically excludes other stuff, like material properties that can push and pull on other physical things. So that reduction of what we believed was in the world is the move to the mechanical worldview, and it comes with some pretty profound consequences for how we think about ourselves. But let's do a little bit of even setup for this. Recall where this mechanical worldview came from. So Bala talks about how mechanisms imported from China and, in this case, from the Middle East, sort of inspired the European thought that the whole universe is like a mechanism. So here we've got a picture of Al-Jazari's floating orchestra. It's a bit of a novelty. It's a bit of a party trick, but he built a small boat, and these were like miniature figurines riding around on a mechanical boat, and some of them would play tiny instruments. And I as I understand it, music would come out of this thing. Some of them would look like they're paddling, and the whole thing would sort of travel around on a little pool of water and entertain party guests. Or more recently, take this little guy, the mechanical monk, built sometime in the 1560s by a Spanish craftsman. So this mechanical monk, it still exists. We have the actual monk still. And it's got little feet that look like it's walking. It's rolling on little wheels, but it simulates walking, and its mouth can open up and its head can turn. It's very creepy. Now, of course, no one actually thought that these automata were full-blown thinking beings, but they were pretty popular as sort of like entertainments and marvels. But they inspired the thought that perhaps we are something like that. I mean, you can build an automata like the mechanical monk and nobody thinks that it's a real thinker, but it gets the thought going that maybe the world is just mechanical. Maybe we are just extremely complicated mechanisms, to the point where in the 1600s, Thomas Hobbes could say with seriousness and be taken seriously, by ratiocination, I mean computation. Okay, so ratiocination is reasoning, and for him, computation is obviously not computers yet, but like doing something like mathematics. So Hobbes, playing off the kind of mechanical worldview, and in the context of a shift towards the mechanical worldview, Hobbes takes this step of saying, you know what, I think our minds are similarly just mechanical. For Hobbes, all of rational thinking can be boiled down to manipulating symbols according to mathematical rules. He talks about reasoning being nothing but addition and subtraction. he's got a kind of broad view of what counts as addition and subtraction. So he says, for example, quote, "From the conceptions of the quadrilateral figure, an equilateral figure, and a rectangular figure, the conception of a square is composed." So in conceptual addition, he means something like if you add up a four-sided figure, the idea of a four-sided figure, and the idea of an equilateral figure, and the idea of a rectangular thing, then you get the idea of a square. So addition is a bit abstract here, but he's thinking of this in terms of addition and subtraction, which are, of course, mechanical operations, right? You have the same inputs, they give you the same outputs every time, assuming that you did it right. Now, although Hobbes was saying this during the kind of heyday of the mechanical worldview and the scientific revolution, he wasn't going unopposed. Not everybody was willing to accept that our minds are just mechanical. So René Descartes famously rejected this idea, but only partly. So Descartes was very much a product of the scientific revolution, just like Thomas Hobbes was. But he rejected the idea that you could explain complex human behaviors in terms of mechanisms. Descartes was happy with the idea that, for example, all animals are merely complex mechanisms, and even the idea that our bodies are complex mechanisms. He was on the forefront of trying to understand, for example, our nervous system in mechanical terms. So Descartes thinks that the mechanical worldview can get you pretty far in explaining pretty much everything about the world, but there's one line that he thinks you can't cross. That is, you can't use mechanical explanations to tell us how we think and produce complex level human language. So here's a quote from Descartes, basically arguing this idea. He says, "For we can certainly conceive of a machine so constructed that it utter words, and even utters words which correspond to bodily actions causing a change in its organs. For example, if you touch it on one spot, it asks you what you want of it, and if you touch it on another, it cries that you are hurting it, and so on. But it is not conceivable that such a machine should produce different arrangements of words, so as to give an appropriately meaningful answer to whatever is said in its presence, as even the dullest of men can do." So he's arguing here that we can't even imagine, it is inconceivable, it's a very strong claim, it's inconceivable that you could build a machine that he's not arguing that you can't build a machine that can do language. Certainly you can imagine a machine that you press a button and it says a phrase. What he says is inconceivable is that it would give appropriate context-sensitive answers that have meaning for it. So the meaning of language, Descartes thinks, is something that you can't reduce down to mere mechanisms. And his conclusion, actually, if you know some history of philosophy, his conclusion is the human mind must not be a physical thing. It's a pretty good argument, actually. He says, look, all you scientific revolution guys believe that the world is just a mechanism. Fine. But you can't reduce human language use down to mechanisms. Therefore, there's something to humans that it goes beyond the physical. Therefore, dualism. So Descartes believes that the mind is literally a non-physical substance that is gifted to us by God. So, that's Descartes' argument. Part of the central parts of one of the central parts of Descartes' argument for dualism. That is, the mind and the body are literally separate kinds of stuff. Okay, so what about that crucial step in that argument? So I hope that you honed in on the crucial premise in that argument, which is that you can't build a machine that genuinely understands and uses language in a meaningful way. That's the part that he claims it's inconceivable, but doesn't really tell us why we should think that too. So, but let's try to reconstruct some of what he might think here. So, one reason is the very nature of a mechanism, right? So, a mechanism is something that, given the same inputs, does the same thing, right? A mechanism, a good mechanism, a working mechanism, behaves the same way so long as it gets the same inputs. And the mechanical worldview was one in which we try to formulate the laws of nature in terms of invariance in the world, right? If you have this physical setup, you get this physical consequence. So the laws of nature were being understood as this kind of mechanical, one input, one output sort of deal. Now, when you say something happens mechanically, I take it what you mean is it happens in a kind of invariant, repetitive manner. If you say somebody's behaving mechanically, what you mean is they're doing actions in this kind of repetitive, unthinking way. But the amazing thing about human reasoning is that we're not generally like that. We don't usually act like machines. If you ask a person the same question over and over again, they don't just give you the same answer over and over again. They start to get annoyed. They remember that you asked them just a minute ago. They start to be like, what's wrong with you? Why do you keep asking me the same question? So given the same inputs, our answers vary widely. And we don't have this quality of just mechanically responding to inputs the way that a clock does or an automata does. So I think it's not like there's nothing to this argument from Descartes. There does seem to be something profoundly different about us than all of the machines that we're familiar with. Now, that doesn't quite get us to the point where we've proven that artificial intelligence is impossible, right? What we need to do to defeat Descartes' argument here is build a machine that can genuinely understand language, which I note that we haven't done yet. So in the next video, we'll talk about some of the history of attempts to do this, and we'll find that, at least in the 20th century, we didn't even come close. I won't get up to the 21st century because this is more historical than that, but I take that we still don't have any machines that can meaningfully understand language and produce language that is meaningful to that machine. Walmsley, in the readings for this week, lays out a very deep problem for Hobbes' way of thinking about this. In some senses, it's a conceptual problem. And we can see this coming out of Descartes, essentially. So, reasoning, you might say, is truth tracking. If you're reasoning about something, and what you're trying to do is come up with the truth about it, right? That sound good? But evaluating the truth of a sentence, say, requires understanding its meaning. If you want to be reasoning about the world, you have to understand the sentences or formula that you're reasoning about, and they have to be meaningful to you, or you're not really reasoning. But if the scientific worldview showed anything, it's that meaning isn't out there in the world, right? That was Aristotle's view. That meaning is literally in the world somehow. And the scientific revolution was all about stripping that meaning out of the world and showing how it's something that we produce rather than something that inheres in the world. So the paradox of mechanical reasoning is, mechanisms can't track meaning, right? Mechanisms aren't responding to the meaning of the symbols they're manipulating. They're just responding to the kind of physical properties of it. That's the mechanical worldview. So how do you get meaning into a mechanical symbol manipulator? That's the so-called paradox. It might not end up being a paradox, because if you can build a machine that can genuinely understand meaning and reasoning, then you've shown actually mechanisms can do this. But so far, again, we haven't done that yet. It's still a mystery how to get meaning into a machine. Okay. But that's not to say that some aspects of reasoning can't be formalized, of course. So in the mid-1600s, for example, Blaise Pascal built a mechanical calculator. It could do addition and subtraction and multiplication and division if you just used repeated addition and subtractions. This was improved by Leibniz. Leibniz in the late 1600s, he produced what he called the stepped reckoner, which could do multiplication and division kind of directly. So I think it's obvious that these are examples of something we normally think of as reasoning, which is doing math, being realized in a machine, right? Doing math requires intelligence of some sort. Here's a machine that can do some math. So it's clearly not the case that all aspects of intelligence are beyond the possibility of a machine doing it, right? Here we go. Your normal pocket calculator can do some things that you would normally call reasoning. So it's not that every aspect of reason is clearly beyond mechanism, but maybe something like complex human language use. Following up on the history of this stuff, so in the mid-1800s, Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace developed designs for the first general programmable computer. So those calculators can only do certain operations. The analytic engine was meant to be a computer in the sense of a mechanical machine that you could program to do many different functions. So Babbage designed the mechanism, which wasn't electronic, it was just gears and levers and stuff, but and Ada Lovelace designed the first ever computer programs for it using punch cards, literal punch card technology. They never actually built this, unfortunately. The kind of mechanical and funding problems were too much. However, people looking back at their designs pretty much all agree that it would have worked. So this would have, if they could have gotten over the practical problems of actually having it built, this would have been a functioning programmable computer. Little clunky, not very fast, but it would have been a working programmable computer. It's not till the 1940s that we get the first electronic computers. So this is a picture of ENIAC with a couple of its programmers, Betty Jean Jennings and Fran Billas, who you might notice are women. There was a whole bunch of women involved in the very early history of electronic computing. ENIAC weighed about 30 tons and had no built-in memory and could do about 5,000 addition problems per second, which is a lot for a human, but not a lot for a modern computer. Programs were literally hardwired into this thing by sometimes like pulling, you can see some wires hanging out here, like a plug board situation where you like have a plug and you pull it out of one socket and put it in another, or big boards of switches. You just physically move the switches. So there's no built-in memory. The programming is done by literally rewiring this thing. And data can be input and output via punch cards. So the first problem that ENIAC was directed towards, this was in the mid to late 1940s, which was an exciting time geopolitically, if you recall. It was used, the first problem that was directed towards was calculations for the nuclear bomb. The output for these problems consisted of something like 1 million punch cards. So massive, massive kind of like physical output of data. And it indeed was helpful to sort of help design and build the nuclear bomb, which shortly thereafter flattened a couple cities. So, okay, so really brief history of how we got to electronic computers. You know, we're clearly all familiar with the idea that machines can calculate. But the question is, does that count as thinking? Now, Descartes' challenge to mechanical reasoning was not that doing math is impossible. He would have accepted that, mathematical operations are quite doable. Rather, his claim was that you can't get the full complexity and richness of human language in a mechanism with genuine understanding of the meaning of the words being used. So, there have been a lot of machines built over the last 100 years or so that look like they're doing something intelligent. And the question that philosophers ask about this question, ask anyway, is, are they genuinely intelligent? That is, are they just simulating intelligence, or are they real intelligence in some sense? And if they are just simulating it, what would it take for something to become real intelligence? So weak AI is the simulation of intelligence, a machine that just sort of looks like it's thinking. Strong AI is real intelligence, an actually thinking, understanding machine. So, I can simulate understanding languages that I don't speak. If I read out a sentence in, Polish or something, I could make the sounds and it would look like I'm understanding. Well, probably not, but a native speaker would know that I'm not really understanding what I'm saying, but I could simulate understanding a language that I don't speak. So the strong AI, weak AI distinction is like that. You can get a computer, of course, to produce linguistic structures. You can get it to say words even. Can you get it to understand the meaning of what it's saying and doing? That's the essential question. Or is it? So very shortly after the invention of the electronic computer, people started talking about the possibility of artificial intelligence. And one of the absolutely central pioneers of the electronic computer was Alan Turing. And Alan Turing, in some sense, rejected that question. So he writes this paper in the early 1950s about whether computers can think. So he produces this quite famous, I hope at least some of you have heard of this. He produces this famous way of thinking about this question: can computers think? Which in some sense rejects this strong AI, weak AI distinction. It wasn't a distinction anybody had made at that time, but he produces an answer to that question that really boils it down to, like, does it look like it's thinking? And if it does, that's good enough. So in his 1950 paper, he argued that if something can convincingly act intelligent, that's all that we should bother worrying about. That the question of is it real intelligence is a bit of a red herring. It's not really a clear question. Turing was a computer scientist. He likes clear questions. So he thinks it makes no difference. So instead of this abstract philosophical question, can machines think? Is there a difference between real AI, or strong AI and weak AI? Turing proposes the following. So one person sits in front of a monitor and a keyboard, and you're having a typed conversation with either a computer or a person, and you don't know which it is. So you're having this like wide-ranging open conversation, and the goal of, so in this image, person C is having either a conversation with A, a computer, or B, a person. The person C is trying their best to shape the conversation to guess whether it's a computer or a person. So they're asking probing questions. They're trying to like see if they can detect computer likeness in the conversation. And after repeated tests, and then at the end of the test, so you have a conversation of some duration, and then you ask person C, hey, which one do you think was the computer and the person? And the computer passes at least one round if the person guesses that the computer was a person. Now, that's a 50-50 thing. Passing the Turing test isn't quite that easy. You need to do repeated tests, right? So you need to run this test over and over and over again. And then if the computer gets around, the closer it gets to 50-50, so if 100 people have a conversation with this computer, if 50 of them guess that it's a person, it's a either or question. If 50 of them guess it's a person and 50 guesses a computer, that's as good as you can get on the Turing test. So thinking back to that strong AI, weak AI thing, is it real intelligence or is it just simulated? Turing's saying here, that's not a meaningful question. The only meaningful question is, can it act like? Can it convince you that it's intelligent? And convincing you is really the only thing we should care about. So that's a rejection of this idea of strong and weak AI. If you simulate intelligence well enough, Turing says, then you've got intelligence. That's whatever. Anything beyond that is just sort of quibbling with words, he thinks. So in the next video, I'm going to go through some of the early history of trying to achieve this goal of creating a computer that can convince us that it is thinking.